They experimented with their oft subversive self-expression, from fashion to spirituality. They explored equally subversive gender and sexuality. More famously, though, they embraced death. Is this Goth, or is this Victorian? Is Goth a subculture, or just part of a cycle? Why does beauty keep returning to the eroticization of death? From decay to decadence in the pursuit of light within darkness, this podcast will illuminate how the Goths resurrected the fascinations of the Victorian era. I'm Ashley Egger, and this is my second podcast. Check out my previous podcast on this page with my friend and classmate Anna Hiesberger to learn about the fractured legacy of black letter type. Today, I am joined by my mistress of the dark, Grace Maddox. Unfortunately, Elvira couldn't make it as well. Just kidding. Grace, say hi.
Hello.
Yeah, Grace is an artist at UNT with me, and she's super smart and she's super goth. The past 4 years, I've had an insatiable passion for the goth subculture, its music and history, which was kind of the missing link to a lifetime of my own morbid fascinations. I cannot credit Grace enough for putting me on to the Sisters of Mercy my freshman year, which truly opened Pandora's box for me. She is quite the expert, and I think I've done enough personal discovery to hold a candle to her knowledge of the subculture by now. If you want to say anything, now's your chance.
I mean, yeah, that's something that I've just been interested in since I was, 15 in high school, and it was just something that kind of like took a hold on me. I was really interested in the way that they rebelled against the current modern day music and sort of their stand on just like the inclusivity in their community was something that I really liked. I liked that it was a place where people of any background could come to and just feel seen and just have the same interests as the people around them. And I don't know, I just really loved that, and I just wanted to be a part of it. It just made me feel like, especially in high school where I was kind of dealing with trying to find myself as a person, I liked that there was a place where it didn't really matter what time or place you were at in your life. You could just be a part of that and enjoy the music with people, and
yeah,
it was great.
And there's something to note, obviously, is the fascination with the macabre and finding beauty in death and those kinds of morbid curiosities. And if you could see Grace now, she is a picture perfect goth woman. What a wonderful woman.
Yeah, thank you.
What a wonderful woman. Amazing woman. I don't know. She's super smart and talented, and yeah, I wanted to include her in this discussion because she put me on to something that is something I hold very dear to my own identity. And when I took this Victorian class, I connected so many dots that this had to be my capstone, so to speak, on what I've learned, because this is the end of my time at UNT and I have an art history degree, so it kind of makes sense to focus on what I'm most passionate about now. However, today I will be shedding light to a facet of goth that cuts a notch below the 80s. We're taking it back to the Victorian times. But before we get into that, I need to explain what was actually going on at the time, because otherwise, when I say like the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, it just sounds random. So we're in the Victorian era, and you've got this really distinct group forming. They're basically a secret society, and everything about them is intentional. The art they're making is radical for its time, and it's more than aesthetics. It's this whole like ideological influence. They're actively embodying these subversive perspectives that are going against cultural norms at the times. Even the name itself is kind of confrontational. They're rejecting the Royal Academy and its obsession with Raphael as the peak of artistic mastery. Instead of following that model, they deliberately call back to earlier art, like the Romantic era, which is often cited in the goth subculture with like Charles Baudelaire in The Cure's lyrics,
Yes,
etc. So, but basically what I'm saying is that they're already positioning themselves outside the system. And stylistically, they're doing something totally different too. They're embracing nature. They're focusing on the really intimate and hyper-realistic detail. They have this, like, sanctity of preserving the way that nature looks. So photorealistic. Instead of the big and grand historical paintings that the Academy was promoting. It's less spectacle and more about the closeness, emotion, and intensity. Many of these paintings pull their subject matter from literature and mythology at the time as well. The rebellion stuff is really just like the entry point. What matters is how their ideas start to shift perspective more broadly. Their work resonates with people who already feel out of place in the Victorian society, especially as it becomes more industrialized and more restrictive. There's this growing sense that something isn't right, and that the pre-Raphaelites are kind of giving visual form to that feeling. And from there, it spreads. It doesn't stay contained to this small group. It starts influencing how people think, how they see themselves, and how they relate to society. And over time, that builds into something bigger, into actual progressive social change. It wasn't just an art movement. It was marking the shift in how people are understanding themselves within a changing world. So I want to say all that to say that rebellion was not just coming out of nowhere. It's showing up as a reaction to something bigger, some kind of pressure within society that people are pushing back against. And in this case, that pressure is the Industrial Revolution, especially as it was peaking during the Victorian era with that second wave of industrial growth. Because this was a time when they were building factories and they're having steam, and then textiles were mass produced. We talked a lot about this new shade of purple called Mauvine, which is my personal favorite color of all time, and it was Purple Mania. But to paint a picture of what it felt like to live through, I want to reference a Victorian writer, Edward Bulwer-Lytton. People usually know him for the whole "it was a dark and stormy night" line, but in his 1883 essay collection, England in the English, he says something that I think really resonates here. I saw it, he said, "Every age must be called an age of transition, but in our age, that transition is visible," which I think is really key to describing the Victorian era, and why I think it also really relates to the turn of the century vibe that was happening in the 1980s with the goth movement, because like there's this mass change that people are feeling around about the world around them, and so they just have to find some kind of outlet that rebels against that. And even today we see it with people dipping into nostalgia for their own form of self-expression. I think it just really resonates because people go back when they are afraid, or I guess frustrated with the way that modernity is cramping humanity, if that makes sense. People can actually feel and see the change happening in real time. Me going back to the script. Mass production is taking over, and craftsmanship is starting to disappear. In the British Empire...
Just shit crashing down. I'm just kind of feeling like with all the meowing that's happening anyways, and then that happening, is just like your teacher would look at that and be like, it's such cat behavior.
I know, and that's why if you've been able to notice the audio recording pausing, my cat is just absolutely crazy, and I did not own her at the time I filmed my last podcast. Anyways, mass production is taking over. Craftsmanship is starting to disappear, and the British Empire is expanding outward all at the same time. Everything is getting bigger, faster, and more impersonal. And then there's the population shift. England is going from rural to urban in about 100 years. In London alone, the population jumped from just over 1 million to over 6 million. Like, the change in the population cannot be understated. This is crazy. City life is basically brand new, and the people are just thrown into it and expected to adapt. Yeah, if you had money, white skin, and a socially normative identity, it was probably easier to navigate. But for a lot of people, it was rough, overcrowded, polluted, and just miserable conditions. So when you see this return to nature in pre-Raphaelite work, it's more than aesthetic, it's aspirational, it's escapism. And okay, I couldn't help it. I wanted to quote Sweeney Todd here, which is set in 1845 London. There's a hole in a world like a great black pit, and it's filled with people who are filled with shit, and it goes by the name of London. And I'm shortening it, that you get the idea, and pardon my French. That's how the city felt to a lot of people. So the Pre-Raphaelites are working in that context. On one hand, they're creating this kind of escape, this idealized world rooted in nature and beauty. But at the same time, they're also drawing attention to these really vulnerable emotional states, especially for people who are struggling within that system. So again, it's not just pretty paintings, it's a response to a world that's changing way too fast. And you know who else was doing that, but in the 1980s? The Goth people.
Hell yeah.
Do you have anything to say about that, Grace?
Well, I think that it was definitely rooted a lot in escapism. I think that the way that art as a movement, like history and the things that people think, the things that were happening to people in their current time, it was influencing more than just art. It was also influencing music of the time. And I think that goth music was a way to express sort of the grief that came with that, and then also was able to build on that. It started off as an expression of just like feeling depressed in that moment and having to adapt to everyday life
and not really having any control.
Yeah, and just honestly like looking out in the world and wondering where you fit into that society. And it was really hard for a lot of people to just find that, fast and quick. Like, it was a really destructive process. And I think that music was kind of a way for people to listen to. It was kind of an escape mechanism to listen to that music and to feel what that artist was saying wholeheartedly. And in other ways too, it was a way of just like feeling content and feeling like, there was an outlet to the world changing so quickly as it did. And I think that's why goth music really took off as a movement itself, is because like people were really needing that during that time, was that outlet.
Yeah. And exactly. And we're going to talk about it later, but like the kind of expressiveness of their style and clothing just kind of evokes that, like, just, I guess, psychological place that they're at, like it's your inside being expressed outwardly. It's not conservative. It's not modest. It's just artful.
Yeah. And whenever I say grief too, I mean, they're wearing all black. It's that kind of rebellion as well.
And it's kind of tongue-in-cheek in a way, although black is such an irresistible color to wear. Once you're in that mindset, you're not even kind of thinking about it. I feel like I'm not trying to be a certain way. It's just what I reach for all the time.
Yeah. It's that absence of,
Yes, there's something just so enticing about it.
Yeah.
I love colors. If you could see my room right now, it's very eclectic, but like my own, even though I know your room is a void. I love like an accent color, like purple, which is very Victorian of me, and red, which I guess was a popular color too. Yeah. But obviously classic. It's like sanguineous. You want to wear it. But anyways, let's get back on this train. there's more. I want to talk about a lot of artists really quickly to cover a lot of bases that existed within the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which again was this like secret society. And these are some of the founders and prominent figures. Dante Gabriel Rossetti was the main founder during the pre-Raphaelite era. Hi, this is a sidebar. I wanted to mention that poetry was so inextricable from Dante Gabriel Rossetti's art, and that is another through line that I think really drives in the point I'm making about Goths being modern Victorians, because of the way that this poetry and literature informed the art that was being created, or vice versa. Like, I know that Dante Gabriel Rossetti and his muse would often like write poetry that accompanied their art pieces, whether the poetry or the art came first, and even like so much of Goth is inspired by old poetry. Even if we go back all the way to the graveyard poets who wrote about skulls, bones, worms, and epitaphs, the examples flood my mind, but one of that comes to me most poignantly is The Cure's How Beautiful You Are, almost directly referencing, or I guess quoting, Charles Baudelaire's, I think it's called The Eyes of the Poor, is the name of the poem. And it opens with that line. They both open with the same line. And it's just so important. And I think that's what sets Goth apart as a music genre, is that connection it has to Romantic era poetry and Victorian poetry too. But yeah, I just thought that was important to say. His paintings focused a lot on sensual spirituality, longing, obsession. I just did a podcast, I was telling you about this, where he was obsessed with this novelty of exotic creatures as the Victorians were discovering Australia. Mm-hmm. So he kept this pet wombat, which he named Top, after William Holman Hunt, who I want to talk about a painting from. He had this painting that we discussed in depth earlier this semester called The Awakening Conscience from 1853. And the woman, who, from the context of the metaphors in the painting, is likely the other woman. And she's rising from her place, sitting in a man's lap, as if she's having some moral epiphany. And I want to mention this painting to show how psychological realizations are becoming a central theme to the pre-Raphaelite movement, and how that also can relate to the Goth subculture. But also, in this painting and other paintings, they're imbued with this idea of the subversive femininity, which we talked about at length at the beginning of the semester. But it's basically women who are fallen women and who don't fit inside the conservative traditional values, which you see our society currently kind of regressing to. So I find a lot of comfort in how the Victorian era embraced, or at least the pre-Raphaelite artists, the subversive artists of this era, embraced that type of femininity that was scorned and rejected. And maybe they found it novel, but I think it sheds light on it because they were painting their muses, who also wrote poetry and all this stuff. And as I'm saying it now, I'm like, this is so Goth, like the poetry, the romanticism, the flaws and the decay of society, all this stuff. It's so Goth. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there's also John Everett Millay's Ophelia from 1852, which romanticizes a peaceful and beautiful death swallowed by nature. Because, again, this is rejection of urbanization, of industrialization. So there's this, I don't know what, this sublime beauty, I guess, I don't know, mm-hmm. of death. And obviously you hear this and you're like, this is literally it's again so Goth. Like, I should have a sound effect that plays every time I talk about that. So Goth. And then there's Edward Burne-Jones, who painted a lot of eroticized death and blurred gender boundaries, like in his Depths of the Sea painting from 1886. He painted these passive men and women who subverted repressive gender norms prevalent at the time, especially as this androgynous, assumedly female, albeit fish, figure drags down the man to his eventual demise with an innocuously cheeky smile, like she doesn't even know. But this is important because it's showing the feminine man, and these paintings remind me of the Bauhaus album art cover that is the photo from The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is a German expressionist film. But Cesare, or however you say his name, the somnambulist in that film, he's depicted like with his arms out and his legs are together, and it reminds me so much of this like gender subversion in pre-Raphaelite art because of the sinuous curves and like kind of the dainty figure and the the emphasis on kind of hollowed out eyes and cheeks, and it's very androgynous, and when you compare it to these paintings it feels very like feminine, even though it's just kind of a gaunt guy with makeup on.
Yeah. I mean, it's really just like being, I feel like with that album cover, because I know what you're talking about, like, he's spread out and he's, he kind of looks like, to me, with just, like, not even really knowing about that, my first thought is that he is just, like, in the middle of a dance and that he is dancing.
Yeah.
But not even knowing the context of that photo, I can see that it was seen as, maybe, more eroticized or more feminized.
Yeah,
feminized.
Yeah.
And I find that really interesting because I think Bauhaus is like a really, like, that band itself is a really like influential,
formative
band. Yeah, for that culture.
If they were if Goth was the pre-Raphaelites, Bauhaus would have been John Everett Millais.
Yeah.
He would have been William Holman Hunt of the Bauhaus.
Yeah, so that's really interesting because I know they were that band itself too was just really influenced by those films and that photography too.
Which we will talk about towards the end of this podcast, the German Expressionism.
Yeah.
Which I became very obsessed with after I had taken that class, which I regret. Thankfully, I'm taking this this class has caught me at a very Victorian time of my life.
Yes, I can tell.
So
Victorian.
Even though I'm exhausted when I'm in it, my ears are always perked, so to speak. But I want to get into Simeon Solomon, and I think I talked to you about Simeon Solomon. You might not know this after I had this class, because I think he used his his paintings as an outlet for his own queer identity. His paintings were imbued with this queer coding. One of my favorite paintings is his Bacchus from 1867, which reminds me, when we were in this class, it reminded me so much of Frankenfurter from Rocky Horror, and here's why. This is a Roman god of wine and excess. He is traditionally tied to indulgence, pleasure, and a kind of loss of control. Joy Division reference. But Solomon pushes it further. His version leans into androgyny, sensuality, and this almost languid, melancholic decadence, which is a movement that we are not talking about yet, but we will. It's not just about partying, it's about desire, identity, and vulnerability, all mixed together. Rocky Horror has a quote, which is what Frankenfurter's from, that I literally want to put on my grad cap, which we still have to do. Yeah. We will do that.
We will. Yes, I need to do it soon. Yeah.
I just haven't had time. I will after this is submitted.
Yes, I know, it's been crazy.
You really do just finish your degree up on some random Wednesday.
Yeah, for real.
But the quote is, "Don't dream it, be it." The production is excessive, and it's basically everything I spoke about in relation to like Simeon Solomon and all those other pre-Raphaelite painters, though they are not as indulgent as Aubrey Beardsley, which I will talk about later. The last line, though, has always lingered with me, and it kind of reminds me of the ethos of the Victorians at the time. which goes, "And crawling on the planet's face, some insects called the human race, lost in time and lost in space and in meaning." Richard O'Brien is a queer icon and a genius. And I know that this is not goth technically, but there is a lot of overlap with this kind of culty, campy theater and goth people. I mean, me personally, like, I literally have the Rocky Horror lips tattooed. I moved to Denton because of it.
I mean, that's why Rocky Horror was so influential at its time. I mean, it was set, like, only showing in theaters at 12 a.m. And it was, like, so secretive. But the people that were up during that time and they were watching it, I mean, it's not even only influenced in goth culture, but also in drag and in music.
Yes, and all of that also influenced goth, and which influenced those things as well. Like, this is a web of subversive proclivities.
The mixture of, I mean, it was just so different from film at that time. And it came out in, like, the 70s or 80s?
It came out in 1975 was when they had their first stage production, or when the movie came out.
Yeah, which at that time would have been
the first stage production came out in 1973.
Really? Yeah.
Yes.
So, I mean, 70s time frame, that's going to be, like, I mean, anything. It's going to be very, like,
and that's right before goth, so it's like there's totally overlap with people who were like punk or whatever at the time, who eventually came into this melodrama of, it's so, goth is so it's like the theatrical punks. I mean, I know that they have this stereotype of doom and gloom, but, you know, they were called positive punks, you know, back in the day, before they were retronymed goth.
Yeah, I mean, like, it definitely stemmed from that, but, like, goth, I think that, like, a lot of the theatrical elements, the dramaticism of that play, or just their, you know, their lives and the music they were listening to, that was something that I think was, like, kind of the cornerstone of the subculture itself, and kind of made it its own version, so it was separate from punk. Like, it wasn't, it wasn't just, so... I think that, like, you know, Frankenfurter, especially with his attitude, his makeup, for sure, his costume, that was a big influence. I really do believe that it was a big influence on, like, the way that people dressed in that subculture, because it was just so flashy, and it was so different, and it was so... dare I say, avant-garde of its time. I just, like, it was a rebellion of previous, like, makeup looks and fashion looks, and I think it just
echoes the past and, like, Victorian, it just, these ideals, that's why I introed the podcast saying, like, is it a cycle? Like, these things come around every time that there is a reaction against a more repressive society. But I think it's especially felt at, like, towards the turn of a century, like, when we're gearing up to it. And I think why it's so prominent now in the early, like, the 2020s, well, people are very into aesthetics and not so much getting involved below the surface.
Yes, and I could talk
ad nauseum about that. Yes. But, yeah, you know, it's this time of mass technological change. It's just a reaction. But I wanted to say that this also reminds me of another cult icon I've recently become obsessed with, Hedwig, from Hedwig and the Angry Inch. And this is a heavy recommendation for a kind of rock musical. They're both decadent people that represent queer identity, overindulgence, and breaking free from a repressive society. And at the end of the movie, I swear, Hedwig literally is wearing a blonde wig that looks like Susie Sue's hair, or like Patricia Morrison's hair. It's insane. But I feel like we're starting to tiptoe around the decadence movement. And before that, we have to talk about aestheticism. So the aesthetic movement is where artists start to detach from the idea that art needs to serve a purpose beyond itself, like art for art's sake. It's no longer about morality or storytelling or religion in the same way that the art of that came before. It becomes about beauty for its own sake, which is basically what I just said. And that sounds kind of simple, but at the time, it's actually a huge deal, because up until this point, art is expected to do something. It's supposed to teach you, it's supposed to guide you, or reinforce values. And now you have people saying, what if it doesn't? You see this really clearly with James McNeill Whistler, especially with works like Nocturne and Black and Gold, The Fallen Rocket. Even the title alone is doing something different already. It's not descriptive in a narrative sense, it's descriptive in a sensory sense. He's naming it like music. Hello, music, like so important to the subculture.
Yes.
And at risk of sounding cliche, like you're supposed to feel it rather than interpret it. And that's a shift away from representation and into atmosphere. Joy Division reference. At the same time, this idea of the aesthetic self starts to emerge, which is exactly what it sounds like. People begin dressing themselves like works of art. The way they dress, the way they decorate their homes, even the way they interact socially becomes curated. It's intentional, it's constructed, and this is where fashion starts to become deeply tied to identity in a way that feels very modern, very goth, dare I say.
Yes, I agree.
Once you remove meaning and you remove morality, what you're left with is just sensation, just experience. And decadence fully leans into that. This is self-indulgence. This is unabashedly high contrast from the societal norms at the times. You have figures like Oscar Wilde, whose existence is built entirely around this idea. The dandy archetype we talked about in class comes in here. Someone who is completely self-fashioned and whose identity is no longer something you inherit, it's something you perform. And the performance is everything. And then visually, you get Aubrey Beardsley, whose work honestly feels like it's pushing the limits of what was acceptable at the time. And you look at it now and you're like, oh, that's just like an ink painting. But like these illustrations were making people come to Oscar Wilde's plays just so they could see the illustration that accompanied it, you know? And these illustrations are so stylized that they almost reject reality altogether. They have these exaggerated bodies and these elongated, flattened, like forms that are so ornamental and decorative, and the spaces feel artificial, but they have this sexuality, and it's so present, and it's not naturalistic. It's heightened, and it's theatrical, and it's detached from reality. You know, you have Salome from 1896 on the cover of Oscar Wilde's play, and she's literally holding the decapitated head of a man, which is so like against the gender norms, which were so patriarchal at the time and so male-centric, and women were practically like caged birds to be freed. I could quote Sweeney Todd again, but I won't. So yeah, it's desire becoming aesthetic, and this is where I think decadence really overlaps into goth. But there's this fixation on decline and on decay and on the idea that things are falling apart, but instead of resisting that, it's kind of embracing this decay and it's turning it into something beautiful. And it's such a recurring pattern throughout society. But earlier I was starting to touch on fashion, and I want to get back into that because what we need to bring into this is something more tangible that you can like understand more than just me talking about these paintings, and that's fashion. Because Victorian fashion is where all of these ideas become visible, and it's not subtle. You've got corset, crinolines, bustles, and all these structural elements that are literally reshaping your body into something unnatural. They have these tiny, tiny waists and exaggerated hips and these massive silhouettes that take up space in a way that feels intentional. And there's this constant tension between restriction and expansion. Of course, all the conservative men are like, these women are taking up so much space. But women can't even own bank accounts at the time. So they're literally stampeding through these marketplaces, which you can see in Punch magazine, destroying everything in their path. And you know who has to pick up the tab? The man. And of course he complains, but the woman's not the one picking up the check. She can't cash a check. Yeah. You know? Women were obsessed with it.
Women were put in a position where they were very stripped from just everyday rights that we look at today, that I think is like hard to come by as a Victorian woman. And I think that like now, at that time, it was really no choice, and that's just kind of what you grew up with as a woman. Like, you learned the rules of society and you had to obey to them, or else you're not going to be a successful person.
Yeah, exactly.
Life, so.
But the thing about like the crinoline was it kind of was liberating in a way, even though it was like wearing a bird cage, which feels like a metaphor on its own. Like, women couldn't be groped anymore. Like, they couldn't, like, they got to take up space, literally. And there's actual documentation of crinolinomania, which we were talking about, which is what it sounds like. It's this widespread fixation on the crinoline silhouette. And at the same time, there's that criticism from the men. People saying that it's impractical, dangerous, excessive, and other people who frame it as empowerment. And it's women taking up that physical space and becoming less accessible to the male gaze. And so even fashion becomes a site of tension, which, again, you can see with Goths.
Yes.
You know, like, it's a provocation. It's rebellion. It's taking up space, you know?
Yeah.
And then you layer mourning culture on top of that, because Victorian mourning practices were so incredibly structured. After a death, especially someone like Queen Victoria mourning Prince Albert, you have these extended periods where what you wear is dictated very specifically. Full mourning, and then half mourning, and then you can introduce muted colors like purple and gray. And when we visited the Texas fashion collections, they even had this Victorian mourning like top that you would wear over a dress, and it kind of was just like a shawl thing that you button. It was completely black, but when you open it up on the inside, it had that like mauvine bluish purple on the inside. Yeah. So you were kind of able to introduce these very selective colors, and of course they're colors that are very popular to goth people.
Yes, the blues and the cool tones.
The cool tones, the jewel tones.
Yes.
And then you get stuff like jet mourning jewelry, which is literally made from fossilized wood and carved into these intricate kind of gothic designs, or even hair jewelry, where people were incorporating the hair of their deceased into wearable objects. So it's this kind of stuff that is very unsettling to Western society. But yet the Goths kind of also have this fascination with it, you know, almost over 100 years later, you know? Mm-hmm. Okay, this is the next day, but I wanted to add a little bit of an addendum to the script talking about Goth fashion and as it relates to the Victorian time, because we're talking a lot about crinolines right now, and I remembered, like, there's also, you know, the broad shoulders, and you can see that in the shoulder pads of the 80s. And there's also the corseted waist, which is another thing that the goth people adopted out of the Victorian times. And that tight lacing is its own, in my opinion, its own subculture that is active today. And I thought I would be interested in it, but it's kind of hard to wear a tight-laced corset when you have classes all day. But there's also, you know, the pointed boot, the winkle picker. It's a very Victorian silhouette again. So you have this androgyny that you see with people like the lead singers of bands, even like people like Nick Fiend, who looks like an alien. And you know, it goes from the singers to the actors. I think of Grace Jones, who's an honorary goth, and you have these silhouettes that are echoes of the Victorian era, and these ideas that are echoes of the Victorian era, and then it's all imbued with this, like, death and fascination with the macabre and this gloominess that you hold. I can hold the Victorians, especially during this, like, at the pre-Raphaelite era onward, hold them up next to the 80s Goths, and the Venn diagram starts to kind of look like a circle. So I just wanted to add that in there in case I forgot to talk about anything. But yeah, those like high necklines, the broad shoulders, the small waist, the bell sleeves. I love a bell sleeve. And all of this in Victorian fashion had its own sense of symbolism. You know, we talk about the crepe fabric and how it symbolizes the transparent, like it symbolizes light leaving your life in a high neckline when you would wear it with Victorian morning fashion. And I just think that this artistic sense of expression to convey such poetic themes is so Victorian and so goth, and I wish I remembered to talk about it then, but it's too important to leave out.
Yeah.
The body doesn't just disappear, it stays with you, and it becomes part of your presentation, and grief becomes aesthetic, which is not something we do the same way anymore, but you see it in the goth aesthetic.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. And then there's gender, which is my favorite and honestly one of the most interesting parts of this whole thing. Because even though Victorian society is known for being extremely rigid in terms of gender roles, the art coming out of this period is something much more fluid. You have men being depicted with this softness, this delicacy, and emotional vulnerability. They have these enlarged eyes and soft jawlines and almost feminized features. And you can see this across so many pre-Raphaelite works. And you also see it in this, like that, the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which was also referenced in Bauhaus. So there's like this through line, I feel like, that goes through the centuries, you know? And even women were depicted with this kind of physical assertiveness that pushed against expectations. And then you get full-on androgyny, like with Edward Burne-Jones in The Depths of the Sea, which I talked about earlier. The blending of the masculine and the feminine and something, making something ambiguous, you know? And then the Simeon Solomon stuff, which was also incredibly risky at the time. Like, Aubrey Beardsley was literally jailed for sodomy, which is, like, it's so deplorable that, like, you know, you could not express your gender and sexuality in the same way that you can today. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, with the goth subculture kind of blooming around the time of the AIDS epidemic, there's echoes of the past and what they kind of appreciated and what were and how they kind of stood in rebellion. You know, this is kind of a heritage for people who are perpetually in mourning.
Yes.
You know?
No, that goes in line again with what I said about the community that comes with the goth subculture, where it's like all these different facets of life. And I think that the AIDS epidemic was another event in that current time that was just like just hanging over people's heads constantly.
Yeah.
And like the goth scene, I mean, it was filled with queer people.
Yeah.
And people that have either dealt with that themselves or seen that with other people. And I just think that, like, you know, it kind of gave a space for that, you know, sodomy, although I think that in like 1980s, maybe it wasn't seen as nationally as being like a crime. There were still instances of that, and there was still like that,
and people
depiction.
Being persecuted for that lifestyle, even if it wasn't
even
always
if it wasn't
legally,
intense,
like socially, you were a pariah. Exactly. And Aubrey Beardsley literally lost his job, like his career as an illustrator, for being outed as gay. Yeah, you know,
which is terrible.
Obviously, it's terrible, but. You know, I think it's interesting that there's these through lines that kind of connect, like, you know, death is everywhere. There are flies on the windscreen, to quote Depeche Mode.
Yes, love that. Love that album as well.
Such a good album.
Yes.
But, you know, there's this embracement, you know, because you can't predict the future and it seems like the odds are stacked against you, but you have to kind of find those moments, you know,
like instead of just constantly being like,
it's like the ultimate comfort.
It is like finding that safe space,
yes. And I think that's why, connecting it back to the pre-Raphaelites, the Ophelia painting and other paintings, you know, when they were, you know, particularly interested in like like, so the subconscious and spirituality, which I'll touch on later, like, finding comfort in kind of the emptiness, I guess, and what's beyond that, like, what we know here on earth, because it doesn't satisfy us.
I really believe that it filled a void for people.
Yes, like, love in a void.
Yes, because like it needed to be there. You know, for those people. Was that culture? That music, that art.
It's just the parallels are just. I feel like, for me personally, and hopefully now you too, like, I feel like you can't talk about one without the other. And it makes me feel even more connected to the goth subculture, that, like, because in the 80s they were pulling all these references from the Romantic period and the Victorian period and in the modernist period, and every, like, it's imbued with historical reference. And I feel like today there is so much focus on the aesthetic that we are losing touch with that media literacy and how that shapes who your life. It doesn't. I feel like my lifestyle was very similar to as it is now, but now I feel like I'm supported by this kind of heritage of people who thought and felt the same way. If that makes sense.
No, exactly. I think that's something that is like just it's just the backbone of that community itself. And like, if you don't have that, then like that's like the substance of it all, really, to me. I think not
it's
having
the substance.
that, it's
like, I've been saying this over it in my head, but like like substance over style. You know?
Exactly. That history and that impact, and like really putting yourself in that position of just like how these people felt during times of like you said, like prosecution, or even just the hatred that was just raining down on people during that time. It's like, you know, looking at it from a surface level view, like if you take in goth culture from that level of just very blank and very stylistic, then you're just not going to get that same intention that came with it.
Well, and it also feels so much more enriching, you know? Like, I feel, even when I'm, like, on days like this where I'm wearing sweatpants and just a band shirt, like, I just, you feel connected, and that's kind of what humanity is all about, you know? And it sounds like we're winding down, but we're not. I want to talk about spirituality,
so much more to say.
Science, and the inner mind. I know, so much. But yeah, at the same time all of this is happening, there's this growing fascination with spirituality that runs parallel to this scientific advancement, because it's like the industrial era, you know, everything is like, there's so much progress. Like, that was probably the key word of the time. So the spirituality notion seems contradictory, but it's actually not, because it allowed women to get more heavily involved with scientific and creative hobbies while being socially acceptable. And that's where you get the Victorian spiritualism, which was seances and automatic writing and attempts to communicate with the afterlife, which is so crazy. And I actually want to pull up specifically this image of a painting by artist Georgiana Houghton, because she was creating these automatic drawings that are supposedly guided by spirits, and she started doing this in 1861. And when you look at them, they don't feel like traditional Victorian art at all. They're abstract, layered, chaotic, and almost psychedelic, and they feel very contemporary. So
yeah, I found that to be very inspirational. I just like, that is very moving to me, because I'm someone that knows more about just like modernism, you know, sort of like post-Victorian art, and that
it almost feels like an expressionist painting.
That automatic
proto-expressionism.
Exactly. That automatic art, and especially being a woman, right?
Right.
Like
yes.
That in art history, I think we all know
it's so few and far between.
Yeah, so it's amazing. It's very, like, it makes me feel so great to hear
I love
that.
This song.
Me too, dude. Okay,
lock in.
But no, that is very like aspirational. It's just like very great to hear, because like I'm thinking about surrealist artists, and they want to try to like open up this unconscious mind and
Yes.
have that be
the exploration
way.
of the subconscious. It was
Yes.
so prevalent at this time.
Yeah, and so to see this and
The precedent.
and it being like so over, like it's like washed over. Like I haven't heard of this woman, but I've heard of surrealism and how it kind of follows that same value of just sort of living.
And then it goes into like the psychedelic band posters. You know, everything is a pipeline.
Yeah.
We're working on a pipeline, literally Depeche Mode.
Yeah, we are. We are. But yeah, I think that's something like the act of making art intuitively whenever, again, art has been so like structured and formulated, it's just like that is just so groundbreaking to me.
And you know, I kind of the kind of art I make on a regular basis is my makeup. Because when I have time, I love to just, you know, create something, and it emphasizes that beauty and decay when I put my white foundation on and I contour the crap out of my cheekbones and my nose and my eyes even, trying to make my eyes look sunken in, and having this black lipstick like Victor, like the Frankenstein's monster in the novel when he has black lip. Like, it's this intuitive form of expressionism is basically what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
But basically, this spirituality, it opens doors for women to participate more actively in artistic and intellectual spaces because it's framed as spiritual rather than purely scientific. And German Expressionism, I know we don't talk about it in this class, so I didn't include it in my script, but it's all about, you know, the psychological and intuitive art and just expressing feeling as rawly as you can. And you can see it in, like, the linocut, the woodcut, like, portraiture that they would do during this movement, how it's just black and white, and it kind of mirrors the precedent that Aubrey Beardsley set with that Salome painting I talked about earlier. But going into German Expressionism is, because it's important to talk about these pipelines that extend beyond Victorianism time, because these ideas all bleed into each other, from medievalism going into Romanticism, into the Pre-Raphaelites, and now we're here. And so we're moving into the 20th century, and these ideas start to intensify into these movements like German Expressionism, and things are just getting more and more raw, because instead of romanticizing emotion or aestheticizing it, expression just puts it out there. It's disordered, it's exaggerated, and it's sometimes uncomfortable. And you see it like with Edward Munch in The Scream, which is so iconic. And the entire environment is warped to reflect this internal anxiety, and it's not what the world looks like, it's what it feels like. And that's a major shift on its own, because it's prioritizing psychological truth over beauty. And Goth really embraced that, and they took those Victorian principles and they reflected it on what was going on during that century, the 20th century, and they applied it to the turn of their century. And I think that they took the principles of the 20th century and they were kind of mirroring the 19th century's ideals as it was shifting towards a more modern climate, you know? And so that's when the cycle returns to Goth, and you take a step back and you look all out of this, and it starts to form a pattern. Victorian mourning, decadent fashion, it's not coming out of nowhere. It's part of a cycle. You have the Pre-Raphaelites reacting to industrialization and restriction, and the decadents embracing excess and collapse, and the Expressionists reacting to psychological instability. And then you get Goth in the 20th century, and it's pulling from all of it.
No.
And you look at bands like the Sisters of Mercy or the broader post-punk scene, and you see these themes all reemerging. The melancholy, the theatricality, and the identity as performance, and the fascination with death and decay, and you're subverting your sexuality and your gender identity. I mean, Nick Fiend from Alien Sex Fiend, which is a band that I think emerged from the Batcave scene, along with like Specimen. These people were freaks. They didn't look like their assigned gender at birth because they weren't anything. They were like, I guess Ziggy Stardust is the mainstream like association of with that non-binary, that non-binary like cultural identity.
Yeah.
So all of this is a response to its own context, these post-industrial landscapes, political tension, and cultural fragmentation. It's all reactionary, just like everything that came before it. I'm so grateful that you got to join me on this podcast.
I'm so grateful that you included me on this, because this has not only been a learning experience, but also something that I feel like I can, like, talk about the knowledge that I know. And
yeah, make it feel academic.
Yeah, like, I just love, like, comparing, like, the things that I know and learning new things and recognizing the influence on, like, a culture that I've been very, very much involved in since, like, for years. So.
I know, and you know, you can tell. You know, even if you were wearing no makeup and the most basic outfit, you can tell. And I know that's a very rewarding feeling, personally.
It's been a long journey. I finally made it.
But, you know, this is that kind of commitment. So, yeah, signing off. This is Ashley Egger, student, not for long.
Yeah, same here. Grace Maddox.
Not for long student. If only she could take your class.
If I could take another year, honestly, I would take that class.
I know. I talk so much about it. I have really enjoyed so much that I've learned. I'm probably not going to edit this as much as I edited my previous podcast, but this is my last assignment in my degree plan. And I'm not going to get emotional about it, but it is Cinco de Mayo. So thank you so much for this opportunity. Goodbye.